Well, in the spell, we explore how powerful ideas about scarcity and progress and growth and even salvation shape entire civilizations. And few ideas have cast a longer or more consequential spell over the developing world than the promise of the Green Revolution. The story is often told as one of triumph: improved seeds, synthetic fertilizers, mechanization, and science defeating hunger. We saw yields rising, famines receding in parts of Asia, and a model of modern agriculture emerged that was capital intensive and input heavy and globally integrated. But every revolution does cast a shadow, and in Africa the Green Revolution arrived a bit later. It was more unevenly and with far more contested outcomes. It met complex land systems, fragile infrastructure, and millions of small-scale farmers who were never merely beneficiaries of development policy, but economic actors navigating risk and tradition and credit constraints and political power as well. So in this spell, we interrogate how modernity often confuses scale with virtue and efficiency with morality. And I think agriculture may be the purest example of that tension. You've got big commercial farming versus smallholder resilience, export markets versus food sovereignty, input dependency versus ecological balance, and perhaps most importantly, who really captures the value in the food system? Well, to unpack this, we're joined by Dr. Tinashe Kapuya, who's the Director of Research at the African Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, ANAPRI, and he's got a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Pretoria and has worked across the policy commercial divide from AgBiz to USAID and the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And born in Zimbabwe, certainly he understands both the lived realities of smallholder farming and the institutional logic of large-scale agribusiness. And today we interrogate a very difficult question. Has the Green Revolution in Africa empowered small farmers or absorbed them into a system that they don't control? And more broadly, are we still under the spell of a particular idea of what agricultural progress must look like? Tinashe, welcome. Big questions, but firstly, tell me a bit more about how you came to find yourself in a very agri-focused career path.
Well, it was somewhat of an accident, really. When I finished my advanced level studies, I was more inclined to become an agronomist. So I had done agriculture in my earlier years as a subject, and then when I ended up at university, I was actually looking for something that is related to more to agronomy and crop science. The agronomy and crop science class was full, and I was told that I have to find something else to do because I had applied late. And then I ended up in an agricultural economics class with 12 students. So it was the smallest class in the whole faculty, and I ended up loving agricultural economics far more than the agronomy or soil science subjects that I could have pursued. So because that's where you look at the not just the economics of agriculture and the practical realities of commercial agriculture versus subsistence agriculture, but that's where you also look at the space of development, how policy affects different segments of our value chain, and it's a far more interesting field, I would imagine, than looking at seeds and soils in a lab, as I would have initially wanted. But not to denigrate all the good work that our agronomists and our soil scientists do. I just think that I feel that I think I'm more cut out for policy work and value chain work than the hard sciences.
It's a fascinating example of how sometimes we may have an idea of where our life is taking us, and fate intervenes in a very unusual way at the time.
I agree, 100%.
Only when you look back on your career, you think, wow, had I not applied late or not walked into that particular class at that moment, my life could have turned out rather different. I could have ended
up somewhere, yeah. I would have been in a lab, wearing a lab coat somewhere.
and not talking to me. So I'm very grateful that you took that decision.
Absolutely.
And that class. Now, when we talk about the green revolution in Africa, I mean, in the spell, we argue that modernity often assumes that scaling up equals improving outcomes.
Yeah.
Did that assumption shape agricultural development policy in Africa?
That is a good question to ask, Michael. But my personal view is the agricultural green revolution never really kicked off in our continent. It didn't take off. It was a false start from the beginning. Simply because we never scaled the issues around access to modern inputs like seed and fertilizer. It's still an issue in the continent. And to a large degree, it's not even about availability, it's about access. Which means that a lot of our farmers cannot get a hold of modern technology simply because we have infrastructure issues that make it so expensive and inaccessible for our farmers to be able to actually use those inputs. For a long time, we have issues around what they call last mile delivery. Being the major critical bottleneck. And by last mile delivery, we are saying when you how do you get the input from the retail to the farm gate? So if you get your inputs all the way to a district, getting that input from a warehouse or an agro dealer all the way to the farm gate, it could cost you a whole lot more than it would cost to buy it maybe at a port in the city, where the transport costs keep adding up to a point where it becomes uncompetitive or unviable for farmers to adopt.
It's fascinating because when I hear you talk about it, it does sound very much like the Green Revolution in Africa was something of a policy experiment gone awry because of those infrastructural challenges. But let's talk about when you look about the structure, it's often pitted as big agri versus a smallholder or small-scale subsistence farmer. When you look at the structure, who actually captures value in African food systems today? Is it the farmer? Is it the input supplier? Is it the banker on the other end? Is it the trader, or is it the retailer? Where does the value get captured?
So we've done a lot of value chain work in the different parts of the continent, and the picture is very nuanced. And I can give you a few examples of how different structures of the value chain lead to different outcomes. So the long and short answer to your question is who captures the value varies. Most of the value, I think, obviously lies outside of the farm gate. Beyond the farm gate is where most of the value lies. That is a structural reality across the entire globe, that a lot of the value is generated in the agro-business and agro-processing segments of the value chain. But in many parts of Africa, where you have fragmentation, a lot of fragmentation, or farm communities that are detached from markets, and in many cases where information asymmetry leads to maybe traders taking advantage of those information asymmetries to make supernormal profits. You might find that traders are making more money than the actual big companies, but in many cases you find that a lot of the markets that farmers service are local because they are informal. And that's where these informal markets, they probably don't offer maybe as many margins, as high markup or margins as the formal markets. But what you typically might have is, traders and agro-processors, depending on whether those agro-processors want to perform a lot of the other functions that allow them to access aggregation points where traders are taking some of that product. What we realize is that in export-oriented value chains, for instance, some of those value chains they're not necessarily monopolies, but they have a lot of, they call them monopsonies, where you have a few buyers, and in those cases, those scenarios, you will find that there is a lot of margins that are accruing to the exporters or the agro processors that are exporting that product. And sometimes you find that where governments are exerting control, market controls, in typically your staples, the margins are suppressed for a lot of the agro processors or the traders, because as markets fluctuate and probably prices rise, governments under pressure to ensure food access sometimes cap some of those prices, and then that squeezes out a lot of the margins that your other players in the value chain would otherwise accumulate. So we have a very complex picture. You find that staples have a very different structure, and your export markets, export-oriented value chains also have a different structure. And then you have these other crops that governments don't typically focus on, having also a different structure where margins are captured on the basis of who has more information on prices, who has more access to the product, who is offering more incentives, and in that sense, you find that farmers, by and large, do not get to benefit as much as they should in across different circumstances.
Yeah, and again, it's a very nuanced picture depending on the size of the farmer and also in which markets they're operating. But I think it is safe to say that not enough of the value is being captured by the farmer to encourage and send signals to the market to attract new entrants, to ensure we deepen food security. In your PhD work, what did you find out about the nexus between large-scale commercial agriculture and the smallholders? Is this kind of coexistence realistic, or does consolidation inevitably occur in some kind of dependency?
Yeah, when I did my PhD, there was an interesting trend that we were trying to investigate, Michael. We had seen a lot of consolidation that was happening at the global level. So mergers and acquisitions were becoming quite frequent amongst major global agricultural companies, traders mainly, and logistic providers. We were beginning to see that trend occur in certain spaces in the African continent, where your big traders like ETG and a lot of these South African big companies like Senves, Avery, NWK were beginning to also make a lot of investments in the continent, but were partnering with other big conglomerates in order to access these new markets. It was a period where I think agriculture was beginning to emerge as a critical, profitable enterprise. I think commodity prices had risen quite a lot, and land, people were talking about land being abundant in the continent. So there was a lot of thinking around the potential for agriculture to really grow. I think the Africa Development Bank had said by 2030 the agribusiness and agriculture would amount to $1 trillion business overall. So I think there was this appetite to invest and appetite to really make profits from agriculture and capture the market opportunities that existed at the time. The discourse was, when these investments are coming into the continent, we don't want them to be exclusionary. We don't want smallholder farmers being left behind. And the fear was that was beginning to happen, especially when large-scale land acquisitions were pushing farming communities out of the land, and we saw a lot of land transactions happening at that time as well. So we had a lot of companies, development partners and governments pushing for responsible investments, quote unquote, which was a plea for companies to design business models that would effectively ensure that smallholder farmers and commercial farmers are all participating in the value chains. So we saw the emergence of hub and spoke models, and they show different arrangements that were basically trying to create demand for inputs and product, final product, involving smallholder farmers, smallholder farming communities benefiting from input demand around, let's say, fertilizer and modern fertilizers and seed, for instance, and extension. While also benefiting from a demand pool from these big companies. Now, that was the excitement at the time, and we were projecting that this trend of agribusiness consolidation was going to continue to happen, with a lot of companies that are trying to penetrate these markets in African countries, partnering with smaller companies and buying them up as a way of accessing local markets, right? Because these small companies had knowledge of how to operate in these informal markets, and we felt that maybe that would be the entry point that these companies would essentially do. But there was a few things that began to happen post my PhD. The trend that we had anticipated would continue kind of halted under the weight of declining commodity prices. So food prices came down eventually, maybe not to levels that we had seen in pre-2008, but definitely came down to new equilibrium levels from 2012, 2013, 2014, and then we had a small peak somewhere there, and then they came down again. The food price, with commodity prices coming down, the profitability was obviously not as much as the post 2008 food crisis. But what was also quite startling at that time was the realization that the land that was imagined to be available for crop production was actually not as much as initially thought. So Africa was not as land abundant, mainly because a lot of the land that was thought to be that was imagined to be brought into agriculture over the next decade was actually land that would cost a lot more money to utilize. It's virgin land. It's land that is remote, that is no access to infrastructure, and as a result, we were beginning to see a revision of that opportunity that we thought existed. So land was not as much as we thought, and therefore there was a scale back of land acquisitions. There was also a realization that the infrastructure issues were still pretty hectic. We still didn't have enough infrastructure to allow for cheaper movement of commodities to make business models more viable, or different business models more viable. And then the consolidation that was happening, or the mergers and acquisitions, didn't last because a lot of companies were losing money because of the complexity of the African markets, governments putting ad hoc bans on exports so they couldn't move goods, commodities like maize out of the country, foreign currency instability or devaluations that were essentially affecting profits. lack of repatriation of money, or laws that were just restrictive, that didn't allow for repatriation of profits. So in many cases, we saw companies failing to fulfill contracts, and as a result, we saw a lot of disinvestment in the African continent from the likes of Cargill. We saw NWK selling their Zambian businesses like Dunavant. Avery scaled back significantly from their trading businesses in the region. And as a result, we saw what was a disheartening trend where the dissipation of that optimism that once existed about how we were going to become to grow this market. What stayed behind was, as these big companies left, there was opportunities for smaller companies, more boutique trading firms, and also smaller entities that were more nimble, that were a little bit more adept to the market conditions. They kind of filled up that space. But we are not looking at capital levels anywhere close to the ones that were being invested by the big guys.
And certainly none of that consolidation that one would have assumed would have occurred had that push continued. On the other side of that, so we had this initial foray and then this retreat. Are we still seeing multinational seed and fertilizer firms interested in Africa as a market whole? And I ask the question because there is obviously a concern around accelerating productivity on the one hand, but also entrenching external dependency on these seed companies, on these fertilizer businesses.
Yeah.
I know many African governments use fertilizer subsidy programs to support their smaller farmers. Is that a solution, or is it a fiscal black hole?
Yeah, I think what has happened lately is a shift in discussion. So it's so difficult to try to talk governments out of subsidies, especially if you have a big smallholder farming sector that is still struggling with productivity issues. Where affordability to inputs is an issue. Of course, we know that sometimes governments are much less likely to get rid of subsidies for political reasons, because the smallholder farming sector is a big political constituency for which government wants to be seen to support. And then there is the rent-seeking that comes with these subsidy programs and the corruption that surrounds it. So it's a multi-million, or if not billion-dollar enterprise across the continent, because we import most of our fertilizers. Maybe north of 95% of fertilizers in the continent, I think, are imported. So the conversation is much less about should we do subsidies, but more about can we design these subsidies in a more efficient way? Can we sharpen our targeting and reduce waste? And as a result, the delivery mechanism is the most viable point of discussion, because governments are probably more prepared to listen to a conversation like in Zambia now, where they are talking about shifting from direct input support to e-voucher systems, digitalizing your input delivery system, making it much more tighter and less prone to corruption and rent-seeking. And Zambians have now completely moved, I think by this year, they have completely moved to a digital kind of system. The direct input support had issues in the past, so they're trying to overcome those. And there's a whole study that was done by the World Bank and AGRA a few years ago, where they were looking at how these models were being piloted in different parts of the continent. They've worked in some places. They've not worked so much in others. So we are not going to see. Of course, the scaling back of subsidies is going to be because of rising debt and lack of fiscal resources. But we're not going to see a complete abandonment of subsidies altogether. I think that is an issue that will be with us for a while. Coming to the point around productivity. So, the African continent, if you look at the cereal yields for the past 20 years, they have grown, but not at the same pace as population growth. So our food demand is outpacing our productivity growth. We can definitely do more at this point in increasing our fertilizer consumption and also in increasing our use of latest seed technologies. Seed that can withstand drought, for instance, and seed that can produce higher yields, like hybrids and so forth. So that is definitely an issue that is still on the table. Adoption is probably limited, I think, by infrastructure, by and large. But I think from some of our analysis is just showing that it gets a little bit more complicated than that. GM regulations, for instance, are still an issue. I think Kenya is still trying to overcome they were on the cusp of adopting GM, but then there were activists who came in and halted the whole process of shifting to more commercialization of GM, which could be a difference maker. And at this point, adopting GM could be all that we need to do to get that quantum leap in yields. The other issue, Michael, that I think we overlooked quite a bit for years is soil health. If we had adopted fertilizer the same way that India embraced fertilizers, and we have whole-scale adoption of different types of fertilizers, Africa would still not have achieved the desired level of yield gains, not least because our soils are impoverished. We don't have soil. We have soils that are acidic in most parts of the continent, so we need a lot of liming of the soil before you can get your pH right, your acidity right. And then you have the carbon content in the soil is still very low. It's I don't know, it's just one of those things. I think that's stemming from years of inappropriate cultivation, poor soil management, and agronomic practices over years that has pushed us probably to levels where we have this problem. So 2 years ago, we had a soil health summit that was just talking about how do we get our soils right. Because we do need to get our soils right in order for our productivity to improve. So we have what is called the African Soil Health Action Plan, which is a continental initiative by the African Union. And the expectation is countries would domesticate those interventions and start to promote sustainable farming methods that can allow a buildup of carbon and content and a buildup of healthy soils. Then you do the adoption of these technologies so that we can have those yields. We can achieve those yields. Timing is an important part of the whole soil health initiative. But when we looked at liming in countries like Zambia, for instance, a bag of lime would cost $25, but transporting the lime to the farm is $100. So it costs 4 times the price of the product to bring it onto the field. Yeah. Because it's a bulky product, and even spreading it takes a lot of manpower and effort. And those are the structural constraints that we face, where your logistics still get in the way of adoption of these technologies, and your transport cost and infrastructure gets to a point where it's not profitable in many instances to adopt these technologies.
And I was going to ask you, with other tools, we hear of satellite mapping, there's Aerobotics, which I think is a local company that was developed to help our macadamia nut industry. There's precision agriculture. There's a lot of talk of using technology. But given that we still have these deep infrastructure gaps across the continent, one wonders whether these tools will further democratize farming or widen the productivity gap even further. And just, building on that as well, I understand that there are efficiency gains that can be had with GM and obviously improved fertilizers. Are we not locking our farmers though into a system that is heavily input dependent and into a cycle of credit and vulnerability, given that it is largely still small scale?
That is a good point. The point to be made, I think up to now, governments in the continent are fearful of being beholden to multinational companies once the adoption of these good technologies take effect, and it's a politically sensitive topic when you talk about farmers having to be overly reliant on hybrids because you're saying the genetics that is being propelled is the breeding rights still lie with these companies, and you can't replicate the same in country and so forth. So for many years, I think governments have been still reluctant to get all these technologies to market, for fear that there will be an over-reliance on the companies that supply them. I think we've seen situations in the United States. I think it could be, if I'm not mistaken, I was watching something on soybean and the issues around Roundup and how companies we have exerting so much control over the product and how it's produced, and how farmers are feeling don't have power at all to decide how they should produce their commodities, and it's real. The fears are real, and if there is also a reality that the adoption of these technologies might exacerbate inequality. There is a section of very vulnerable farmers who are resource poor, and there are also an emergent class of smallholder farmers that have access to resources, that have political connections, and they can influence policy. And they sometimes get preferential access to these input subsidies, and these different classes of smallholder farmers, they are there, they exist, because the smallholder sector is not monolithic. It's very heterogeneous in nature, and there's a good chance that if the adoption of even new technologies could create this rift and this inequality that amongst those smallholder farmers, and also amongst the bigger, broader farming community at large. So adoption and how these technologies filter into the farming communities matters, and it might also lead to widening inequality. The other point now is the scale issue. There are arguments way back, I think schools from the 1960s that made an analysis that smallholder farms are technically efficient. They use resources more efficiently than large-scale farms, and that has been used extensively as an argument to support smallholder production. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at markets and many of these, how these markets are functioning, and the low margins that farmers have to contend with, the farmers that survive the most are the ones who have scale. I recall my professor was telling me, I think, who is also a farmer, Professor Fertilisers. I think they had done an analysis around this. And they said, look, 700 hectares is where you begin to make a decent enough margin for you to survive. Because in the farming,
you can have that resilience.
Yes, you can go for 2 or 3 years of low to negative profits, and then you, in a good cropping year or 2 good cropping years, can take you over the line. So you need to be able to weather those kind of cycles, especially now with unpredictable weather. These small farmers cannot survive the kind of volatility and instability in production, especially if they are entirely reliant on rain. So rain-dependent agriculture is far more risky, and they are likely to go under. That's why I think maybe governments feel duty bound to make sure that that segment of the farming community is perpetually supported. So, are we likely to see are we likely to see small farms disappear over time in Africa, and there's consolidation of the farm units over time? I'm not sure. What we do know is that the average farming age is probably around 63 in certain countries and 56 in certain countries. Wow. And so we don't have enough young people that are doing agriculture at the moment. All young people are migrating to where job opportunities are, which is the urban center. So there's a lot of rural-urban migration that is already occurring, Africa is one of the youngest continents. It's actually the youngest continent in the world. So if you have this old segment of the population that is doing agriculture, and your population is very young, there is a good chance that you might actually have some land consolidation that might happen in the future.
We're going to have you back on. This has been a fascinating conversation through some of these dynamics around the agrarian and green agrarian revolutions across the African continent, because we haven't even touched on, land and politics and power and how that integrates into social stability across the African continent and where we go to from here. But we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. My thanks to Dr. Tinashe Kapuya. A great conversation on the Green Revolution. Well, we know the Green Revolution promised abundance, but as we've heard today, abundance that was never neutral. It certainly has structure and power and winners and losers. Big agriculture brings scale, capital, and global integration. Small-scale farmers bring a lot of local knowledge and social stability and a degree of resilience. And the real question isn't who feeds Africa, it's who owns the systems that feeds Africa. And in the spell, we argue that progress often comes wrapped in a kind of certainty, sometimes scientific, sometimes moral. But today I think we've seen that agriculture is anything but certain. It is political, it's economic, and it's deeply human. Remember, if you've enjoyed this podcast episode, share it, subscribe, and join us next time as we continue breaking the spells that shape our world. Until then, I'm Michael Avery. Take care.